There's something quietly unsettling about a place that used to matter, a main street that once had a hardware store, a diner, a barber shop, now just standing there, windows dark, weeds cracking through the sidewalk. These aren't places at the edge of the map that nobody ever cared about. Some of them were capital cities, some of them fed the entire war effort, and some of them are still technically on the map, with a handful of people who simply never left. Today we're looking at 12 American towns that feel completely abandoned today. Town 12, Centralia, Pennsylvania. If you drove through Centralia, Pennsylvania, without knowing its history, you'd think the place had simply been forgotten. The streets are there, the sidewalks are there, driveways lead to empty lots where houses used to be. But there are no houses anymore, and the smoke rising from cracks in the ground tells you exactly why. Centralia was founded in 1866 as a coal mining community in Columbia County. At its peak, it had roughly 2,700 residents, 7 churches, 5 hotels, 27 saloons, and more than a dozen grocery stores. It was, by every measure, a functioning and lively small town. In May 1962, a trash fire was set in an abandoned strip mine pit at the edge of town, a routine thing that had been done before. The problem was that the pit connected to an exposed coal seam. The fire caught, spread underground, and never stopped. By the time anyone understood what was happening, the fire had burrowed deep into the abandoned mine workings beneath the burrow. For the next 2 decades, residents began noticing things: steam venting from the ground, sinkholes opening without warning, carbon monoxide seeping into basements. In 1981, a 12-year-old boy named Todd Domboski nearly fell into a sinkhole that opened beneath his feet in his grandmother's backyard. The hole was emitting lethal levels of carbon monoxide. He grabbed a tree root and held on. Congress eventually appropriated $42 million for voluntary relocation. By the early 1990s, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania condemned all properties under eminent domain. Most residents left. Most buildings were demolished. In 2002, the U.S. Postal Service revoked Centralia's zip code 17927, officially erasing it from the postal map. As of the 2020 census, Centralia had a population of 5 people. The underground fire has been burning for more than 60 years and has enough coal beneath it to keep burning for another 250 years. State and local officials reached an agreement in 2013, allowing the remaining residents to live out their days there. After that, their properties revert to the Commonwealth. The old stretch of Route 61 through town, cracked, buckled, spray-painted with graffiti, sits closed to traffic. You can still walk it. The asphalt splits and heaves where the heat below pushed through. A cemetery near the center of town is still maintained. Other than that, Centralia is basically gone. Historian David Deacock, who wrote extensively about the fire, described the conditions beneath the ground this way: "This was a world where no human could live. Hotter than the planet Mercury, its atmosphere as poisonous as Saturn's." The fire didn't just destroy a town. It made one of the most permanent, irreversible decisions imaginable, and nobody voted on it. Town 11, Picker, Oklahoma. Picker had the misfortune of being built on top of one of the richest mineral deposits in American history, and then paying for it for the next 100 years. In late 1913, lead and zinc were discovered on land belonging to Harry Crawfish, a member of the Quapaw tribe. A town sprang up practically overnight, named after O.S. Picker, owner of the Picker Lead Company. By 1920, Picker had nearly 10,000 residents. By 1926, the population peaked at 14,252. During World War I, more than 50% of the lead and zinc used by the United States military came from this single Oklahoma mining district. During World War II, the mines kept feeding the war machine. The industry that built the town also hollowed it out, literally. Decades of mining left 14,000 abandoned mine shafts beneath the city and roughly 70 million tons of toxic chat, crushed rock waste, piled up in massive gray hills that rose 200 feet above the flat Oklahoma landscape. Families had picnics on those piles. Kids rode bikes up and down them. The high school track team trained on them. Nobody knew the dust was poison. When the mines finally shut down in 1967, the pumps that kept water out of the underground shafts stopped running. The shafts flooded with contaminated water, and by 1973, that water started seeping out into the surrounding environment. Tar Creek, which ran through the area, began running red from heavy metal contamination. In 1983, the EPA designated Picher as part of the Tar Creek Superfund site, one of the most contaminated places in America. A 1994 study found that 34% of children in Picher had elevated blood lead levels. A 2006 Army Corps of Engineers study found that 86% of the town's buildings, including the school, were structurally undermined by the collapsed mine shafts below and could cave in at any time. The federal government announced a buyout. Most residents agreed to leave. Then, on May 10, 2008, an EF4 tornado with winds of 175 miles per hour tore through what remained of the town. 6 people were killed, 150 were injured, 20 city blocks were destroyed. For the handful of people who had resisted the buyouts, the tornado ended the debate. On September 1st, 2009, the state of Oklahoma officially dissolved Picher as a city. By the 2010 census, 20 people remained within the former town limits. By 2015, the last business, a pharmacy run by a man named Gary Linderman, who had promised to stay as long as anyone needed him, closed when Linderman passed away. Karen Harvey, who grew up in Picher and left in 2002, recalled swimming in the contaminated tailings ponds as a child. We'd go swimming in them, and our hair would turn orange and it wouldn't wash out. The chat piles are still there. The Tar Creek cleanup continues. Most of Picher's streets are now flooded hollows and cracked concrete returning to the earth. Town 10, Cairo, Illinois. Cairo, pronounced Cairo by locals, sits at the very tip of Illinois, where the Ohio and Mississippi rivers meet. That location was once the whole point. In the mid-1800s, Cairo was poised to become one of the great American cities. It was a Union supply base during the Civil War. General Ulysses S. Grant used it as a headquarters in the early stages of the war. It had steamboats, railroads, grand Victorian architecture, and a population that peaked at over 15,000 in 1920. Then things started going wrong, and they kept going wrong. The geography that made Cairo valuable, sitting at the confluence of 2 massive rivers, also made it a flood zone. The town required enormous levee systems just to survive. In 1937, the Ohio River rose to record levels, and the city had to be evacuated. Transportation technology kept moving past Cairo rather than through it. When the railroad bridge built south of town in 1929 connected Missouri and Illinois without passing through Cairo, the town lost its ferry trade overnight. Highways bypassed it. Businesses closed. The civil rights era hit Cairo with particular violence. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, the town became a flashpoint after the alleged police-related death of a young black soldier in 1967. Protests and riots broke out. A white civilian militia calling itself the White Hats formed, and for 142 consecutive nights in 1970, there was gunfire in the streets. Businesses boycotted, bombed, and boarded up. An estimated 5,000 residents left in a single decade. The cycle of poverty, racial division, and economic abandonment has never been reversed. In 2017, the federal government announced the closure of Cairo's public housing projects, the Elmwood and McBride developments, displacing around 400 residents with almost no alternative housing available in the area. In 2023, Cairo finally got its first grocery store since 2015. It closed in 2025. As of 2024, Cairo has roughly 1,506 residents, about 10% of its peak population. The downtown area is largely hollow, crumbling brick facades, boarded windows, kudzu growing up through what used to be storefronts. The historic downtown arch still stands. Beneath it, is a lot of nothing. Walking through Cairo today, you pass buildings that haven't been occupied in decades but haven't been demolished either. There isn't the money or the will. The old Gem Theater, which once anchored the commercial district, is a shell of brick and broken glass. The Alexander County Courthouse still stands, but the county itself is one of the poorest in Illinois. Cairo is a case where almost every force that could work against a place did: geography, economics, race, politics, and where recovery efforts have repeatedly failed to take hold before the next thing went wrong. Town 9. Thurmond, West Virginia. Thurmond is so small today that during the 2005 municipal election, 6 of the town's 7 registered residents ran for office. That's not a joke, that's just Thurmond. In its prime, roughly the first 2 decades of the 1900s, Thurmond was one of the most important railroad junctions in the Appalachian coal fields. The Chesapeake and Ohio Railway ran directly through town along the New River. Thurmond handled more freight revenue for the C&O than cities like Cincinnati and Richmond. 15 passenger trains rolled through daily, serving as many as 95,000 travelers a year. The town had banks, hotels, and the 4.5-story Dun Glen Hotel, which became nationally known and was home to what is reportedly one of the longest continuous poker games in American history. A 14-year marathon that only ended when the hotel burned in 1930. Thurmond was also famously alcohol-free on its main street by the decree of its founder, Captain William D. Thurmond. But just outside the incorporated limits, on a strip called Ballyhack, things were considerably less tidy. The decline followed a single technological shift. When the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway switched from steam to diesel locomotives in the 1940s and 1950s, trains no longer needed to stop at Thurmond for coal and water. The rail yard's reason for existing simply evaporated. Businesses closed. The bank was already gone, lost during the Great Depression. The post office shut in 1995. Today, Thurmond has a population of 5 according to the 2020 census, making it the least populous incorporated municipality in West Virginia. Around 80% of the town is now owned by the National Park Service as part of New River Gorge National Park. The old depot has been restored and serves as a visitor center. An Amtrak train, the Cardinal, running between Chicago and New York, still stops there 3 times a week. Most of the time, nobody gets on or off. The access road into Thurmond crosses the New River on a single-lane railroad bridge, the only way in or out by car. It's the kind of entrance that sets your expectations correctly before you've even arrived. Town 8, Times Beach, Missouri. Times Beach doesn't exist anymore. Not as a place you can visit, not as a community, not as anything other than a name that now belongs to a state park. But what happened there is worth knowing. Times Beach was a small resort community built in the 1920s along the Merrimack River in Missouri. Lots were sold cheaply, sometimes in exchange for newspaper subscriptions. By the 1970s, it had grown to about 2,000 residents. In 1972, the town hired a waste hauler named Russell Bliss to spray the unpaved roads with oil to keep the dust down. It worked. Bliss charged a low rate and did the job efficiently. What nobody knew at the time was that the oil he used was contaminated with dioxin, one of the most toxic synthetic chemicals known to exist, a byproduct of industrial chemical manufacturing. Within months, horses stabled on a property Bliss had sprayed began dying. Birds fell out of the air. Cats and dogs died. Children who played on the sprayed surfaces developed lesions and suffered health problems. It took years for anyone to connect the deaths to the oil. EPA testing in 1982 revealed that dioxin levels in Times Beach were more than 100 times the threshold considered safe for human exposure. In early 1983, the federal government took the extraordinary step of buying out every single property owner in Times Beach, all 800 homes and 30 businesses, and ordering a complete evacuation. It was the largest civilian evacuation in U.S. history at that time. Every structure was demolished. The contaminated soil was incinerated in a specially built facility that operated on-site from 1996 to 1997. processing 265,000 tons of earth. The town was scrubbed from existence. Today, the site is Route 66 State Park. There's a visitor center, a river, some walking trails. The building that serves as the visitor center is one of the few original Times Beach structures that survived. It was used as the EPA's on-site command post during the cleanup. If you visit, the park is pleasant. There is no marker that screams what happened. The landscape has recovered. The community has not, because there is no community. Town 7, Body, California. Body is probably the most famous ghost town in America, and it earned that title the old-fashioned way by being genuinely terrifying when it was alive. Gold was discovered near Bodie Bluff in the eastern Sierra Nevada in 1859 by a prospector named William S. Bodie, who, in a foreshadowing of the town's general luck, died in a blizzard that same winter before he could profit from his discovery. His name was misspelled when the town was officially established, and it stayed that way. By the late 1870s, following a major new gold strike, Bodie boomed. At its peak, around 1879, it had a population of roughly 10,000 people, 65 saloons, multiple brothels, and a reputation as one of the most lawless towns in the American West. Shootings were common enough to be unremarkable. The town's own newspaper once described the typical Bodie morning as beginning with a new corpse. A child whose family was moving to Bodie reportedly wrote in her diary, "Goodbye, God, we're going to Bodie." The gold played out. The population collapsed. By 1920, fewer than 200 people remained. A fire in 1932 destroyed much of what was left. The last mine closed in 1942. The remaining residents simply left, in some cases locking the doors behind them. What makes Bodie remarkable is what happened next. Almost nothing. The buildings didn't burn. Nobody tore them down. When California declared it a state historic park in 1962, the policy chosen for preservation was arrested decay, meaning the structures are stabilized to prevent collapse, but not restored. They are allowed to age as they are, with their original contents still inside. Dishes on kitchen tables, clothes hanging in closets, bottles still on bar shelves. More than 100 buildings remain standing. The park is open year-round, though the road in is unpaved and closes in winter. Visitors routinely report taking things as souvenirs and then mailing them back after experiencing unexplained bad luck. The park rangers have a drawer full of returned rocks, bottles, and artifacts, accompanied by letters of apology. There's a genuine stillness to Bodie that photographs struggle to capture. The Methodist Church still has its organ, beds in the hotels still have mattresses, a jar of patent medicine sits on a drugstore shelf behind a dusty window. Whatever the original residents expected when they walked out the door, they did not expect this, that their breakfast tables and bookshelves would become a time capsule stared at by strangers 80 years later. Town 6, Cahaba, Alabama. Before Montgomery, before Tuscaloosa, Cahaba was the capital of Alabama. From 1820 to 1826, this small town at the confluence of the Cahaba and Alabama rivers served as the state's seat of government. It had real ambitions. It had a state house, hotels, newspapers, and by the 1820s, a population of around 3,000. Then the rivers flooded, and flooded, and flooded again. The Alabama River in particular was relentless. Streets flooded routinely. The legislature finally had enough and moved the capital to Tuscaloosa in 1826, just 6 years after establishing Cahaba. The population didn't leave immediately. The town survived for several more decades, even briefly reviving during the antebellum cotton economy and again serving a grim purpose as a Confederate prison camp during the Civil War, where hundreds of Union soldiers died from disease and overcrowding. But the floods kept coming, and after the Civil War, there was no economic reason left to stay. By the 1870s, residents had relocated to nearby Selma, the last family reportedly left in the late 19th century. Today, Cahaba, sometimes spelled Cahaba, is maintained as Old Cahaba Archaeological Park. The physical town is completely gone. What remains are the street grid, several columns and brick foundations partially reclaimed by forest and vine, and cemeteries. During certain seasons, the surrounding forest floods and the ruins sit surrounded by water, which gives the whole place an eerie, half-submerged quality. It is now considered one of Alabama's most historically significant sites, and depending on who you ask, one of its most haunted. Alabama's first state capital drowned in slow motion and took roughly 50 years to fully disappear. Town 5, Bannack, Montana. Bannack holds two distinctions that don't usually go together. It was briefly the capital of Montana Territory, and it was run in large part by a murderer. Gold was discovered near Bannack in 1862, and within months, the population shot to several thousand. In 1864, it was named the first territorial capital of Montana, a title it held for only 2 years before the capital was moved to Virginia City. But Bannack's real claim to infamy was its sheriff, Henry Plummer, who was secretly leading a gang of road agents called the Innocents. The gang robbed and murdered travelers throughout the region. By the time vigilantes figured out what was happening, Plummer and his associates had been responsible for more than 100 killings. The vigilantes hanged Plummer from his own jail's gallows in January 1864. The gold played out gradually. The population drifted away over the following decades. The last residents left in the 1970s. The state of Montana acquired the site, and it's now Bannack State Park. What's preserved at Bannack is remarkable. More than 60 original buildings still stand, including the jail, the church, the hotel, and the Masonic Lodge. The town hosts an annual event called Bannack Days each summer, when volunteers in period dress demonstrate what life looked like in the 1860s. For the other 50 weeks of the year, the town sits empty under the Montana sky, the wooden storefronts bleaching in the altitude, and the winters reminding everything that the mountains were here long before any of this, and will be hereafter. The gallows where Sheriff Plummer was hanged are still standing. The irony of a sheriff hanged on his own jail's gallows is the kind of thing that sounds invented but wasn't. Town 4, Cisco, Utah. Cisco is one of those places that existed purely because of logistics. And when the logistics changed, Cisco had absolutely nothing else to offer. The town grew up as a water stop on the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad, and later also served the local sheep industry. In the days of steam locomotives, trains needed to stop regularly to take on water and coal. Cisco was a convenient point along the line through the Utah desert. A small community developed around that function. When railroads converted to diesel locomotives in the mid-20th century, water stops became unnecessary overnight. Then Interstate 70, which had previously run through the area near Cisco, was rerouted in the 1970s along a different alignment, taking traffic and any remaining commercial reason to exist away from the town entirely. Cisco has been essentially empty since. A few structures still stand, bleached and collapsing in the desert sun. The landscape is stark. Red rock, flat scrubland, a few rusting hulks of vehicles and equipment. Film crews occasionally use it as a location. It appeared in scenes from the 1971 film Vanishing Point and the 1991 film Thelma and Louise. Cinematically, it's perfect. As a place to live, it ran out of reasons a long time ago. Town 3, Garnett, Montana. Garnett sits in the mountains of Granite County, about 11 miles east of Missoula, at an elevation of over 6,000 feet. It's cold up there in the winter. It was cold up there when miners were working it too, but cold was manageable when there was gold. Mining began in the area in the 1860s. Garnett had its biggest moment in the 1890s, when gold production was at its highest and the population climbed to around 1,000 people. The town had a hotel, a saloon, a school, and all the infrastructure a working mining camp needed. The accessible gold ran out by around 1905, and most of the population left. A second, smaller rush in the early 1930s, when gold prices rose during the Depression, briefly revived the town, bringing in a few hundred people. By 1942, even that was over. A fire in the 1940s destroyed parts of the town. Today, Garnet is managed by the Bureau of Land Management and is considered one of the best preserved ghost towns in Montana, with about 30 original structures still standing. The BLM keeps it accessible in summer via a dirt road. In winter, the road closes to vehicle traffic and snowmobilers take over. There are no year-round residents. The buildings stand where they were left, slowly aging at 6,000 feet. Town 2, St. Elmo, Colorado. St. Elmo sits in the Sawatch Range at just under 10,000 feet the elevation, about 20 miles southwest of Buena Vista. It was founded in 1880 during Colorado's silver and gold mining boom and quickly grew to a population of around 2,000. The town had a school, multiple stores, a post office, and train service via the Denver, South Park, and Pacific Railroad. The railroad was the lifeline when the mines began to play out, and the train service finally ended in 1922 after a series of floods damaged the line. St. Elmo's population scattered. By the 1930s, the town was largely empty. What makes St. Elmo notable is its state of preservation. About 40 original buildings survive along the main street, including a town hall, a general store, and several private cabins, some of which are still used seasonally by descendants of original residents or by people who hold private property claims. The ghost town sits in a valley with mountain views that would be described as dramatic in any real estate listing. The last full-time resident of St. Elmo was a woman named Annabelle Stark, who was born there in 1878 and lived alone in the town, operating a small store for summer visitors. Until her death in 1960, she watched the town empty out around her over the course of 4 decades and stayed through all of it. St. Elmo is now one of Colorado's most visited ghost towns, accessible by a paved road in summer. The buildings are not preserved or managed as a state park. They simply still stand, largely because nobody ever had a reason to tear them down. On a summer afternoon, the main street can feel almost busy with hikers and history enthusiasts. On a November morning, with the mountains draped in early snow and the town entirely empty, it's a different experience altogether. Town 1, Monowi, Nebraska. Monowi has one resident, not one family, one person. The town was established in the early 1900s in Boyd County, in the northeastern corner of Nebraska. It peaked at 150 people in 1930 and has been declining ever since. By 2000, 2 people lived there, Rudy and Elsie Eiler, who ran a small tavern. When Rudy died in 2004, Elsie stayed. As the sole resident, Elsie Eiler holds every municipal office the town has. She is the mayor. She is the clerk. She is the librarian. She grants herself a liquor license each year and levies taxes on herself to keep the town's 3 street lights running. She maintains a small library of roughly 5,000 books, the Rudy Eiler Memorial Library, that she built in her husband's memory. She keeps the tavern open. The sign outside reads, Monowi Tavern, coldest beer in Nebraska. She has never advertised. People find the place anyway. Journalists, road trippers, documentary filmmakers, curious strangers who heard about the town and drove out of their way to see it. There's something about the idea of one person holding the line that people find hard to ignore. Monowi is the only incorporated municipality in the United States with a population of 1. It functions. It has a government, it pays its taxes. Elsie Eiler has been interviewed by journalists from around the world and has become something of a quiet symbol, a person who, when everything else left, simply did not. She has said plainly that she intends to stay until she can't anymore. What happens to Monowi after that is an open question. The paperwork exists, the streetlights are paid for, but a town of 1 has a fairly obvious structural vulnerability. These 12 places aren't random. They were founded for real reasons. Gold, coal, iron, water, rivers, railroads. They were built by people who expected them to last. Some of them were capitals. Some of them supplied the materials that won American wars. And now, most of them are empty, or close enough to it that the difference doesn't much matter. What's strange is that they don't feel tragic in the way you might expect. Mostly, they feel quiet. The buildings that are left still stand, the streets are still there under the weeds, and if you visit on a still day, there's almost nothing to hear except the wind moving through whatever's left. If you found this interesting, hit like and subscribe. We cover places like these regularly, and there's a lot more American history hiding in places most people have never heard of.